Question 1. Process analysis reveals that a contingent of Alabama-based peacekeepers, operating under a UN mandate in a volatile region, observes a group of armed individuals approaching a civilian settlement. The armed individuals are not clearly identifiable as belonging to a recognized armed force, and their intentions are ambiguous, though their presence is causing panic among the local population. The peacekeepers have received intelligence suggesting that these individuals may be involved in illicit activities that threaten civilian safety. What is the most ethically and legally sound course of action for the peacekeepers to protect the civilians in this immediate situation? Option A. Immediately engage the approaching group with lethal force to neutralize any potential threat, based on the assumption that their ambiguous nature and proximity to the settlement pose an unacceptable risk. Option B. Initiate a retaliatory strike against the suspected base of operations of the approaching group, based on the intelligence received, to preemptively neutralize the threat. Option C. Establish a defensive perimeter around the settlement. Use clear verbal warnings to deter the approaching group, and attempt to establish communication to ascertain their intentions, while preparing to use non-lethal force if necessary to prevent imminent harm to civilians. Option D. Withdraw the peacekeeping contingent from the area to avoid direct confrontation and potential escalation, leaving the civilian settlement to manage the situation independently. Correct answer is C. Establish a defensive perimeter around the settlement. Use clear verbal warnings to deter the approaching group, and attempt to establish communication to ascertain their intentions, while preparing to use non-lethal force if necessary to prevent imminent harm to civilians. Explanation. This scenario presents a profound ethical and professional challenge for peacekeepers operating under Alabama's framework for international humanitarian law. The core difficulty lies in balancing the mandate to protect civilians with the inherent limitations and risks associated with peacekeeping operations, particularly when faced with asymmetric threats and the potential for escalation. The decision-making process requires a nuanced understanding of the rules of engagement, the principles of distinction and proportionality, and the moral imperative to safeguard vulnerable populations. The best professional approach involves a proactive and multifaceted strategy that prioritizes civilian safety through de-escalation and the use of non-lethal means whenever possible, while clearly communicating the peacekeeping force's mandate and limitations to all parties. This approach aligns with the fundamental principles of international humanitarian law, which obligate peacekeepers to protect civilians from harm and to act with restraint. Specifically, it upholds the principle of proportionality by seeking to minimize collateral damage and civilian casualties. Furthermore, it reflects the ethical duty of care inherent in peacekeeping roles, emphasizing the protection of those most vulnerable. This approach also acknowledges the importance of maintaining the legitimacy and credibility of the peacekeeping mission by demonstrating a commitment to civilian protection. An incorrect approach would be to immediately resort to lethal force in response to perceived threats, without exhausting all de-escalation options or clearly distinguishing between combatants and civilians. This failure to adhere to the principles of distinction and proportionality could lead to unlawful civilian casualties, violating international humanitarian law and undermining the peacekeeping mission's objectives. Such an action would also disregard the ethical obligation to protect civilians and could result in severe reputational damage and legal repercussions. Another unacceptable approach would be to withdraw from the area entirely, abandoning the civilian population to potential harm. While the safety of peacekeepers is paramount, a complete withdrawal without attempting to mitigate the threat or seeking alternative protective measures would constitute a dereliction of duty and a failure to uphold the core mandate of civilian protection. This would violate the spirit and letter of international humanitarian law, which mandates protection for civilians in conflict zones. Finally, an approach that involves engaging in retaliatory actions against perceived aggressors without strict adherence to the rules of engagement and proportionality would also be professionally unacceptable. Such actions could be construed as collective punishment or indiscriminate attacks, further endangering civilians and escalating the conflict. This would be a clear violation of the principles of international humanitarian law and the ethical responsibilities of peacekeepers. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough assessment of the situation, including identifying the threat, the presence of civilians, and the available resources. This should be followed by a careful consideration of the rules of engagement and the principles of international humanitarian law. Prioritizing de-escalation and the use of non-lethal force while maintaining clear communication with all parties should be the primary course of action. If lethal force becomes unavoidable, it must be applied with strict adherence to the principles of distinction and proportionality, ensuring that the minimum force necessary is used to achieve a legitimate military objective and minimize civilian harm. Continuous reevaluation of the situation and adaptation of tactics are crucial throughout the operation. Question 2. Process analysis reveals that an Alabama-based humanitarian aid convoy carrying essential medical supplies is en route to a besieged civilian population. Intelligence indicates that the convoy's planned route passes within close proximity to a known military objective. The convoy commander is concerned that proceeding along the planned route could either make the convoy a legitimate target or result in disproportionate civilian casualties if the military objective is attacked. What is the most ethically and legally sound course of action for the convoy commander to take under Alabama's adherence to international humanitarian law principles? Option A. Proceed with the original route, prioritizing the immediate delivery of life-saving aid, as the urgency of the situation outweighs the potential risks. Option B. Attempt to negotiate passage directly with the military forces controlling the area without first assessing and mitigating the risks to civilians. Option C. Reroute the convoy to a secondary, safer location that is still accessible to the intended recipients, even if it involves a slight delay or increased logistical effort. Option D. Abandon the aid mission entirely due to the unacceptable risks to the convoy and the potential for unintended harm to civilians. The correct answer is C. Reroute the convoy to a secondary, safer location that is still accessible to the intended recipients, even if it involves a slight delay or increased logistical effort. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a profound ethical and legal challenge for an Alabama-based humanitarian aid worker operating in a conflict zone. The core difficulty lies in balancing the immediate imperative to provide life-saving aid to a vulnerable civilian population with the strict legal and ethical obligations under international humanitarian law, IHL, to avoid causing unnecessary harm to protected persons and objects. The presence of a military objective in close proximity to the civilian population and the potential for civilian casualties if aid is delivered directly creates a complex decision-making environment where the principles of distinction, proportionality, and necessity are tested to their limits. Misjudgment can lead to severe legal repercussions, including accusations of war crimes, and critically, can result in the loss of innocent lives, undermining the very purpose of humanitarian assistance. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves prioritizing the safety of civilians by rerouting the aid convoy to a secondary, safer location that is still accessible to the intended recipients, even if it involves a slight delay or increased logistical effort. This approach directly upholds the principle of distinction by ensuring that the aid operation itself does not become a direct object of attack or inadvertently endanger civilians. It also adheres to the principle of proportionality by minimizing the risk of incidental harm to civilians and civilian objects, which would be disproportionate to the military advantage gained by delivering aid directly through a potentially dangerous area. The necessity of providing aid is still met, but through a method that respects IHL. This aligns with the fundamental duty of care owed to civilians in armed conflict, as enshrined in the Geneva Conventions and customary IHL, which Alabama-based aid organizations are bound to respect. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to proceed with the original route, arguing that the urgency of the aid outweighs the potential risks. This fails to adequately apply the principle of proportionality. While the need for aid is urgent, the potential for significant civilian casualties or damage to civilian objects as a result of an attack on the convoy or its proximity to military objectives would likely be disproportionate to the military advantage gained by the enemy in attacking the convoy or the humanitarian benefit of immediate delivery through a dangerous zone. Another incorrect approach is to abandon the aid mission altogether due to the perceived risks. This fails to uphold the principle of necessity, which, while requiring that military objectives be necessary, also implies that humanitarian assistance, when necessary for the survival of a civilian population, should be facilitated and protected to the greatest extent possible, provided it can be done without violating IHL. A third incorrect approach would be to attempt to negotiate passage directly with the military forces controlling the area without first assessing and mitigating the risks to civilians, potentially implicating the aid organization in the military operations or exposing civilians to further danger. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should employ a structured decision-making process. First, they must rigorously assess the threat environment, consulting with all available intelligence sources regarding the proximity and nature of military objectives and the potential for civilian harm. Second, they must consult relevant IHL principles, specifically distinction, proportionality, and necessity, to evaluate all potential courses of action. Third, they should explore all feasible alternative routes or delivery methods that minimize risk to civilians, even if they are less efficient. Fourth, they must document their decision-making process thoroughly, including the risks identified and the rationale for the chosen course of action. Finally, they should seek guidance from their organization's legal counsel or IHL experts when faced with complex dilemmas. Question 3. During an operation in Alabama, a military commander has identified a legitimate military objective, a command and control center located within a densely populated urban area. Intelligence indicates that the command and control center is actively directing enemy forces responsible for recent attacks on civilian infrastructure. The commander has at his disposal a precision-guided munition that is highly effective against hardened structures like the command and control center. However, due to the close proximity of civilian residences and a hospital to the target, there is a significant risk of substantial collateral damage, including civilian casualties and damage to the hospital, if this munition is employed. The commander is under pressure to neutralize the command and control center quickly to prevent further attacks. Which course of action best adheres to the rules governing the means and methods of warfare under Alabama's framework for international humanitarian law? Option A. Conduct a thorough proportionality assessment, weighing the anticipated military advantage of neutralizing the command and control center against the expected incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects, including the hospital. If the expected incidental harm is excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated, the attack must be prohibited or modified to minimize such harm. Option B. Rely on the assumption that civilian presence in close proximity to a military objective is a calculated risk taken by the civilian population, and therefore, the commander's primary duty is to achieve the military objective. Option C. Assume that any structure housing enemy command and control functions is a valid target, and therefore, the risk of collateral damage is an unavoidable consequence of legitimate warfare. Option D. Proceed with the attack using the precision-guided munition, as the target is a legitimate military objective, and the weapon is effective in neutralizing it, thereby preventing future attacks on civilian infrastructure. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough proportionality assessment, weighing the anticipated military advantage of neutralizing the command and control center against the expected incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects, including the hospital. If the expected incidental harm is excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated, the attack must be prohibited or modified to minimize such harm. Explanation. This scenario presents a significant ethical and legal challenge for military commanders operating under Alabama's adherence to international humanitarian law, specifically concerning the rules governing the means and methods of warfare. The core dilemma lies in balancing military necessity with the obligation to protect civilian populations and infrastructure. The commander must navigate the potential for disproportionate harm to civilians and civilian objects when employing a weapon that, while effective against the military target, carries a high risk of collateral damage. This requires a deep understanding of the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution, as enshrined in international humanitarian law, and as interpreted within the framework Alabama follows. The best professional approach involves a rigorous assessment of the proportionality of the attack. This means the commander must carefully weigh the anticipated military advantage against the expected incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, damage to civilian objects, or a combination thereof. If the expected incidental harm to civilians and civilian objects is excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated, the attack must be prohibited This approach aligns directly with Article 51(5)(b) of Additional Protocol I to the Geneva Conventions, which Alabama's legal framework incorporates, prohibiting attacks expected to cause incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, damage to civilian objects, or a combination thereof, which would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. This requires a proactive and cautious stance, prioritizing civilian protection. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the attack solely based on the weapon's effectiveness against the military target, without a thorough proportionality assessment. This fails to acknowledge the legal obligation to minimize civilian harm and risks, violating the principle of proportionality. Another flawed approach is to assume that any weapon used by an adversary is automatically a legitimate target, regardless of the collateral damage it might cause. This disregards the principle of distinction, which requires distinguishing between combatants and civilians, and between military objectives and civilian objects. Finally, a commander who relies on incomplete or outdated intelligence regarding civilian presence near the target, and thus proceeds with an attack that results in excessive civilian casualties, demonstrates a failure in the duty of precaution. The principle of precaution mandates that all feasible precautions must be taken to avoid, and in any event to minimize, incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with a clear understanding of the mission objective and the nature of the target. This must be followed by a comprehensive assessment of the potential collateral effects of any proposed action, utilizing all available intelligence and employing precautionary measures. The commander must then apply the principles of distinction and proportionality, seeking the least harmful means to achieve the military objective. If the anticipated harm to civilians is excessive, the attack must be canceled or modified. This process emphasizes a culture of restraint and a commitment to upholding humanitarian principles even in the heat of conflict. Question 4. Risk assessment procedures indicate a potential need for Alabama to engage with international legal frameworks concerning the protection of individuals in a scenario involving ongoing armed conflict in a neighboring territory, with potential spillover effects. Which approach best aligns with the established relationship between international humanitarian law and international human rights law in such a context? Option A. Focus solely on the principles of international human rights law, assuming that international humanitarian law is only relevant for direct combatants and not for civilian populations affected by conflict spillover. Option B. Apply international human rights law exclusively, as it provides universal protections that supersede any specific rules of international humanitarian law during armed conflict. Option C. Treat international humanitarian law and international human rights law as interchangeable legal regimes, applying whichever appears more convenient or less restrictive in any given circumstance. Option D. Prioritize the application of international humanitarian law for all matters directly related to the armed conflict and its immediate consequences, while recognizing the continued applicability of international human rights law for broader protections. The correct answer is D. Prioritize the application of international humanitarian law for all matters directly related to the armed conflict and its immediate consequences, while recognizing the continued applicability of international human rights law for broader protections. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between the principles of international humanitarian law (IHL) and the broader framework of international human rights law (IHL). While both aim to protect individuals, their scope, application, and primary focus differ. Navigating situations where these two branches of international law might appear to overlap or conflict requires a nuanced understanding of their respective domains and the specific legal instruments governing them, particularly within the context of Alabama's engagement with international legal principles. The challenge lies in correctly identifying which legal framework takes precedence or is most applicable in a given situation, ensuring compliance with Alabama's international legal obligations without misinterpreting or misapplying the law. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a rigorous analysis that first identifies the specific context of the situation. If the situation involves armed conflict, the primary legal framework governing the conduct of hostilities and the protection of persons affected by conflict is international humanitarian law, as codified in instruments like the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols. This approach correctly prioritizes IHL when its specific conditions of applicability are met, recognizing that IHL provides lex specialis, the more specific law in situations of armed conflict. Alabama's adherence to international law would necessitate this precise application, ensuring that actions taken during armed conflict are judged against IHL standards, which are designed for the unique exigencies of such situations. This is ethically and legally sound, as it respects the distinct purpose and scope of IHL. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely apply international human rights law to all situations, regardless of whether armed conflict is present. This fails to acknowledge that IHL is the lex specialis in armed conflict. While IHL continues to apply during armed conflict, IHL provides specific rules tailored to the conduct of hostilities and the protection of those affected by them, which may differ from or supplement IHL. Applying only IHL in an armed conflict scenario could lead to misinterpretations of obligations and potentially inadequate protection in the context of hostilities. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that IHL and IHL are interchangeable and can be applied interchangeably without regard to their distinct origins and scopes. This overlooks the fact that IHL is primarily concerned with regulating the means and methods of warfare and protecting victims of armed conflict, whereas IHL is concerned with protecting fundamental rights and freedoms of all individuals at all times. Confusing these distinct legal regimes can lead to the misapplication of legal standards and a failure to uphold specific obligations under either framework. A further incorrect approach would be to disregard the specific provisions of IHL when they appear to be more restrictive than IHL in certain aspects related to the conduct of hostilities. While IHL aims to mitigate suffering during armed conflict, it also permits certain actions that might be restricted under IHL in peacetime. A professional must understand that IHL's framework is designed for the realities of war, and its specific rules, even if seemingly less protective in isolation, are part of a comprehensive legal regime intended to balance military necessity with humanity. Professional reasoning. Professionals dealing with situations potentially involving both IHL and IHL should adopt a hierarchical and contextual approach. First, determine if the situation falls within the scope of armed conflict. If it does, IHL is the primary governing law for matters related to the conduct of hostilities and the protection of persons directly affected by the conflict. Simultaneously, recognize that IHL continues to apply and may provide additional protections or govern aspects not explicitly covered by IHL. This requires a careful reading of relevant treaties, customary international law, and authoritative interpretations, ensuring that Alabama's international legal obligations are met with precision and integrity. Question 5. The efficiency study reveals that the Alabama National Guard is exploring novel projectile technologies designed to maximize battlefield impact. One proposed technology utilizes a fragmentation mechanism that, while intended to increase area denial, raises concerns about the potential for causing injuries that exceed what is militarily necessary for incapacitation. Which of the following approaches best ensures compliance with the prohibition of weapons causing superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering under international humanitarian law? Option A. Expedite the development and testing of the fragmentation technology to maintain a perceived technological advantage, assuming that any weapon deemed militarily effective will inherently comply with international humanitarian law. Option B. Proceed with the development and deployment of the fragmentation technology based on its historical acceptance in previous conflicts, without conducting a specific review of its current compliance with the prohibition against superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive legal and ethical review of the fragmentation mechanism's potential effects, consulting with international law experts and conducting simulations to assess the nature and severity of injuries, ensuring compliance with Alabama's obligations under international humanitarian law from the outset of development. Option D. Delegate the primary responsibility for assessing IHL compliance to the engineering and military strategy teams, trusting their judgment on the weapon's effectiveness and potential for harm without formal legal or ethical review. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive legal and ethical review of the fragmentation mechanism's potential effects, consulting with international law experts, and conducting simulations to assess the nature and severity of injuries, ensuring compliance with Alabama's obligations under international humanitarian law from the outset of development. Explanation: the efficiency study reveals a critical juncture in the development of new armaments for the Alabama National Guard. The challenge lies in balancing the imperative to maintain a technological edge with the absolute legal and ethical obligation to adhere to international humanitarian law, IHL, specifically the prohibition against weapons causing superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering. This scenario is professionally challenging because the pursuit of military effectiveness can, if unchecked, lead to the development and deployment of weapons that violate fundamental principles of IHL, thereby undermining the very values the military is sworn to protect. Careful judgment is required to ensure that innovation does not outpace ethical and legal considerations. Most appropriate approach involves a comprehensive legal and ethical review process that integrates IHL considerations from the earliest stages of weapon design and development. This entails proactively identifying potential IHL concerns, conducting thorough impact assessments, and seeking expert legal counsel to ensure compliance with Alabama's obligations under international law. This approach is correct because it prioritizes adherence to IHL, recognizing that the prohibition against superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering is a cornerstone of the laws of armed conflict. By embedding IHL compliance into the development lifecycle, potential violations are mitigated before they can manifest, safeguarding both civilian populations and the reputation of the Alabama National Guard. An approach that prioritizes speed of development and deployment over rigorous IHL assessment is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for the legal framework governing the conduct of hostilities, specifically the Martin's Clause and the principles of distinction and proportionality, which implicitly prohibit weapons causing unnecessary suffering. Such an approach risks the development of weapons that, while potentially effective in the short term, would be illegal to employ, leading to severe legal repercussions and ethical condemnation. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to rely solely on the judgment of engineers and military strategists without adequate legal and ethical oversight. While these individuals possess crucial expertise in weapon functionality and tactical application, they may not be sufficiently trained or equipped to identify the nuanced legal implications of weapon design under IHL. This oversight can lead to the unintentional creation of weapons that inflict suffering beyond what is militarily necessary, violating the core tenets of IHL. Finally, an approach that assumes existing weapon systems are inherently compliant with IHL without periodic reevaluation is also flawed. Technological advancements and evolving interpretations of IHL necessitate ongoing review. Failing to conduct such reviews risks overlooking new ways in which a weapon might cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering, even if it was considered compliant at the time of its initial development. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that integrates legal and ethical considerations as integral components of the weapon development process, not as an afterthought. This involves establishing clear protocols for IHL review at each stage, fostering interdisciplinary collaboration between legal experts, engineers, and military planners, and maintaining a commitment to continuous learning and adaptation in light of evolving legal and ethical standards. Question 6. Cost-benefit analysis shows that a particular internal disturbance within Alabama is escalating, involving organized armed groups engaging in sustained, intense fighting against state forces. The duration of the hostilities is increasing, and there are significant territorial gains and losses by both sides. Considering the legal framework governing armed conflicts in Alabama, which approach to classifying this conflict is most consistent with the principles of international humanitarian law? Option A. Determining the classification primarily by the number of casualties and the overall duration of the hostilities, assuming a higher number or longer duration automatically signifies a particular type of conflict. Option B. Deferring the classification decision to the highest political authorities in Alabama without an independent legal review of the factual evidence. Option C. Classifying the conflict based on the stated political objectives and desired outcomes of the armed groups involved in the fighting. Option D. A meticulous and objective assessment of the factual circumstances against the established criteria for classifying armed conflicts, prioritizing a thorough factual investigation of the intensity of hostilities, the organization of the parties, and territorial control. The correct answer is D. A meticulous and objective assessment of the factual circumstances against the established criteria for classifying armed conflicts, prioritizing a thorough factual investigation of the intensity of hostilities, the organization of the parties, and territorial control. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because the classification of a conflict has profound legal and ethical implications under Alabama law, particularly concerning the application of international humanitarian law, IHL. Misclassifying a conflict can lead to significant violations of IHL, potentially resulting in war crimes, improper treatment of combatants and civilians, and a failure to provide necessary humanitarian assistance. The distinction between international armed conflicts, IAC, and non-international armed conflicts, NIAC, is not merely academic. It dictates the specific rules of engagement, the protections afforded to individuals, and the legal framework governing the conduct of hostilities within Alabama. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a meticulous and objective assessment of the factual circumstances against the established criteria for classifying armed conflicts under Alabama's interpretation and application of international law, as informed by relevant treaties and customary international law. This approach prioritizes a thorough factual investigation, considering the intensity of hostilities, the organization of the parties involved, and the territorial control exercised. The classification must be based on the objective reality of the situation, adhering strictly to the legal definitions of IACs and NIAC. This aligns with the fundamental principle of IHL that the law applies based on the nature of the conflict, ensuring consistent and principled application of humanitarian protections. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to classify a conflict based on the stated intentions or political objectives of the parties involved, rather than on the objective factual criteria. This is a significant regulatory and ethical failure, because IHL is designed to apply regardless of the political motivations behind the conflict. Focusing on intentions can lead to a misapplication of legal protections and obligations, potentially denying essential rights to individuals caught in the conflict. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on the number of casualties or the duration of hostilities as the primary determinant for classification. While intensity is a factor, it is not the sole or decisive criterion. A conflict might be brief but highly intense, or prolonged but with lower levels of violence. This approach risks mischaracterizing the nature of the conflict, leading to the incorrect application of legal regimes and potentially undermining the protective aims of IHL. A further incorrect approach is to defer classification to the political leadership without an independent legal assessment of the factual situation. While political considerations may be relevant in broader strategic decisions, the legal classification of a conflict for the purposes of IHL requires an objective, fact-based legal analysis. Delegating this solely to political bodies without legal expertise can lead to classifications driven by political expediency rather than legal accuracy, thereby compromising the integrity of IHL's application. Professional reasoning. Professionals tasked with conflict classification in Alabama must adopt a rigorous, evidence-based, and legally informed decision-making framework. This involves 1. Gathering comprehensive factual information about the nature and intensity of hostilities, the organization of armed groups, and territorial control. 2. Applying the established legal criteria for distinguishing between international and non-international armed conflicts, drawing upon relevant international treaties and customary international law as interpreted within the Alabama legal context. 3. Conducting an objective analysis, free from political bias or subjective interpretation of intentions. 4. Documenting the factual findings and legal reasoning thoroughly to ensure transparency and accountability. 5. Consulting with legal experts in international humanitarian law when necessary. Question 7. Cost-benefit analysis shows that delivering essential medical supplies to a conflict-affected area in Alabama presents significant risks to humanitarian workers due to the presence of armed groups. Considering the principles of international humanitarian law and the safety of personnel, which of the following approaches best balances the imperative to provide aid with the duty to protect humanitarian workers and medical personnel? Option A. Conduct a thorough risk assessment, engage in dialogue with local authorities and relevant non-state armed groups to negotiate safe passage and access, and implement robust security protocols for the delivery team. Option B. Prioritize the immediate delivery of supplies by sending a small, unarmed team into the area without prior coordination or security assessment, assuming the urgency outweighs the risks. Option C. Suspend all humanitarian operations in the region indefinitely due to the perceived security risks, even though there is a critical need for medical supplies. Option D. Proceed with the delivery of supplies immediately, relying solely on the protected status of humanitarian workers under international humanitarian law to ensure their safety. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough risk assessment, engage in dialogue with local authorities and relevant non-state armed groups to negotiate safe passage and access, and implement robust security protocols for the delivery team. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a direct conflict between the immediate need to provide humanitarian aid and the inherent risks to humanitarian workers and medical personnel in a volatile region of Alabama. The principle of distinction, a cornerstone of international humanitarian law (IHL), requires distinguishing between combatants and civilians, and between military objectives and civilian objects. Humanitarian workers and medical personnel are civilians, and their facilities are protected objects. However, in practice, the lines can blur, and the presence of armed groups can endanger those attempting to provide assistance. Careful judgment is required to balance the imperative to assist with the duty to protect those providing that assistance. The best approach involves a thorough risk assessment and the implementation of robust security measures in coordination with all relevant parties, including local authorities, and where feasible and safe, the armed groups present. This includes verifying the neutrality and impartiality of the humanitarian operation, ensuring clear communication channels, and establishing safe corridors for access and evacuation if necessary. This approach is correct because it aligns with the principles of IHL, specifically the protection afforded to humanitarian personnel and medical facilities. It also reflects the practical necessity of ensuring the safety and security of aid workers to enable sustained humanitarian operations, as mandated by the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols, which Alabama adheres to in its application of IHL principles. The emphasis on coordination and communication is crucial for de-escalation and for ensuring that humanitarian efforts are not perceived as partisan. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with aid delivery without adequate security assessments or coordination, assuming that the protected status of humanitarian workers will inherently prevent any harm. This fails to acknowledge the realities of armed conflict and the potential for deliberate or indiscriminate attacks on protected persons and objects. It violates the duty of care owed to humanitarian personnel and could lead to preventable casualties, undermining the humanitarian mission. Another incorrect approach would be to prioritize the delivery of aid over the safety of personnel by entering a clearly dangerous zone without any security precautions or contingency plans. This demonstrates a disregard for the well-being of the individuals carrying out the mission and is ethically and legally indefensible under IHL, which implicitly requires taking all feasible precautions to protect those engaged in humanitarian work. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to withdraw all humanitarian assistance from the region due to perceived risks, even if there is a critical need for aid. While safety is paramount, a complete withdrawal without exploring all possible avenues for safe access and delivery, such as through negotiation or alternative routes, could be seen as abandoning vulnerable populations and failing to uphold the humanitarian imperative. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a multifaceted approach. First, conduct a comprehensive threat assessment, considering the specific context and actors involved. Second, consult relevant IHL provisions and guidelines from organizations like the ICRC. Third, engage in dialogue and coordination with local authorities, and where appropriate and safe, with non-state armed groups to secure safe passage and access. Fourth, develop clear operational plans that include security protocols, communication strategies, and contingency measures. Fifth, continuously monitor the security situation and be prepared to adapt operations as needed, prioritizing the safety of personnel while striving to fulfill the humanitarian mandate. Question 8. The performance metrics show a significant delay in the medical evacuation of casualties from a simulated disaster zone in Alabama. A medical team is faced with a situation where several individuals require immediate attention, but some are perceived to have potential intelligence value, while others are severely injured but lack any such perceived value. The team must decide on the order and priority of evacuation. Which of the following approaches best adheres to the principles of international humanitarian law regarding the rights of the wounded and sick? Option A. Evacuate only those individuals who are able to walk or assist in their own evacuation, as this is more efficient and less resource-intensive. Option B. Prioritize the immediate medical evacuation of all wounded and sick individuals based on the severity of their injuries, ensuring their safe and dignified transport without regard to their affiliation or perceived value. Option C. Delay the evacuation of all individuals until a thorough background check can be completed for each person to ascertain their status and potential risks. Option D. Evacuate individuals who are perceived to have potential intelligence value first, as their information could be critical to future operations, and then attend to the remaining wounded and sick. The correct answer is B. Prioritize the immediate medical evacuation of all wounded and sick individuals based on the severity of their injuries, ensuring their safe and dignified transport without regard to their affiliation or perceived value. Explanation. The performance metrics show a concerning trend in the adherence to humanitarian principles during a simulated medical evacuation scenario in Alabama. The situation is professionally challenging because it requires immediate, life-saving decisions under pressure, where the well-being of vulnerable individuals is paramount. Misinterpreting or neglecting the rights of the wounded and sick can lead to severe ethical breaches and potential violations of international humanitarian law, even in a simulated context, as it undermines the core principles of medical neutrality and humane treatment. The best approach involves prioritizing the immediate medical needs of all wounded and sick individuals, regardless of their affiliation, and ensuring their safe and dignified evacuation. This aligns directly with the fundamental principles of international humanitarian law, IHL, specifically the Geneva Conventions, which mandate the protection and care of the wounded and sick in all circumstances. Alabama, as part of the United States, is bound by these international obligations. This approach upholds the principle of humanity by ensuring that medical care is provided without discrimination and that individuals are treated with respect and dignity, even in conflict or disaster situations. An approach that prioritizes the evacuation of individuals based on their perceived strategic importance or potential for future intelligence gathering, while neglecting others with immediate medical needs, fails to uphold the principle of humanity. It introduces discriminatory criteria into medical care, which is strictly prohibited by IHL. This approach risks leaving severely injured individuals without timely treatment, directly contravening the obligation to care for the wounded and sick. Another incorrect approach involves delaying evacuation to conduct extensive background checks on all individuals, even those with critical injuries. While security considerations are important, IHL emphasizes the urgency of medical care for the wounded and sick. Prolonged delays for non-medical reasons can be detrimental to their survival and recovery, violating the spirit and letter of humanitarian law, which demands prompt attention to medical needs. A further unacceptable approach is to evacuate only those individuals who are able to assist in their own movement or who pose minimal logistical challenges. This approach prioritizes convenience over the fundamental right to care for all wounded and sick persons. IHL requires that all individuals requiring medical attention be provided with it, and that assistance be rendered to those who are unable to move themselves, ensuring their protection and care. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with an immediate assessment of medical needs. This involves identifying all wounded and sick individuals and categorizing their injuries to determine the urgency of treatment and evacuation. The next step is to apply the principles of IHL, ensuring that all decisions are made without discrimination and with the primary goal of providing care and protection. This framework emphasizes the paramount importance of humanity and the non-negotiable right to medical attention for all individuals affected by conflict or disaster. Question 9. Operational review demonstrates that within Alabama, a series of coordinated attacks have been launched by a well-organized, non-state armed group against state security forces. The group claims to be fighting for regional autonomy and has demonstrated significant capacity to sustain prolonged engagements. There is no evidence of direct military intervention by any foreign state in support of the armed group, nor is there evidence of Alabama state forces engaging in armed conflict with another state. Based on these facts, what is the most appropriate classification of this conflict for the purposes of applying international humanitarian law in Alabama? Option A, an international armed conflict due to the organized nature of the armed group and the intensity of hostilities. Option B, a purely domestic law enforcement operation, not subject to the rules of international humanitarian law. Option C, an international armed conflict, because the group's claims suggest a dispute with sovereign authority. Option D, a non-international armed conflict, requiring the application of the specific rules governing such conflicts. The correct answer is D, a non-international armed conflict, requiring the application of the specific rules governing such conflicts. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because the classification of an armed conflict has profound implications for the application of international humanitarian law (IHL) in Alabama. Misclassifying the conflict can lead to the incorrect application of rules, potentially resulting in violations of IHL, harm to civilians, and legal repercussions for those involved. The distinction between international armed conflicts, IAC, and non-international armed conflicts, NIAC, is fundamental, and determining this distinction requires careful analysis of the factual circumstances. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough factual assessment to determine the threshold and intensity of hostility, and crucially, the degree of state involvement. This approach correctly recognizes that the primary determinant for an IAC, under Alabama's interpretation of international law, is the resort to armed force between two or more states. If the conflict involves organized armed groups within Alabama, the analysis must then focus on whether these groups are acting on behalf of a state, or if the conflict reaches the threshold of a NIAC, characterized by protracted armed violence between governmental authorities and organized armed groups, or between such groups. This meticulous, fact-based approach ensures adherence to the specific legal frameworks governing each type of conflict, as outlined in relevant international treaties and customary international law applicable in Alabama. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately assume any internal unrest involving armed groups constitutes an IAC, without considering the absence of direct state-to-state aggression. This fails to acknowledge the distinct legal regime for NIAC and risks misapplying rules designed for interstate warfare. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the conflict as purely internal and therefore outside the scope of IHL, even if it involves organized armed groups and reaches a certain level of intensity. This overlooks the possibility of a NIAC, which is subject to specific IHL protections. A further incorrect approach is to rely solely on the political designation of the conflict by authorities, rather than conducting an independent legal and factual assessment. The legal classification of an armed conflict is an objective determination based on the facts on the ground, not merely a political label. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive gathering of facts regarding the parties involved, the nature and intensity of hostilities, and any state involvement. This factual matrix should then be analyzed against the established criteria for distinguishing between IACs and NIAC under international law as it applies within Alabama. This involves consulting relevant treaties, customary international law, and authoritative interpretations. If the criteria for an IAC are met, the rules governing IACs apply. If not, the analysis proceeds to determine if the criteria for a NIAC are met, applying the relevant rules. This systematic, evidence-based approach ensures legal compliance and ethical conduct. Question 10. Cost-benefit analysis shows that in the aftermath of a conflict in Alabama, a humanitarian organization has a limited supply of essential medical kits, capable of treating 75 individuals with critical injuries. There are 100 individuals requiring immediate medical attention. If each medical kit is designed to fully treat one individual's critical injury, and the cost of a medical kit is $500, what is the minimum financial outlay required to treat the maximum number of critically injured individuals possible with the available resources, and what is the total number of individuals who can be treated? Option A, $37,500, 100 individuals. Option B, $50,000 75 individuals. Option C, $50,000 100 individuals. Option D, $37,500 75 individuals. The correct answer is D, $37,500 75 individuals. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge in applying the principles of international humanitarian law, IHL, to a complex situation involving resource allocation during an armed conflict in Alabama. The core difficulty lies in balancing the immediate needs of the civilian population with the legal obligations and operational realities of a humanitarian organization. Misinterpreting the scope of IHL or misapplying its principles can lead to severe consequences, including harm to civilians, erosion of trust, and potential legal repercussions. Careful judgment is required to ensure that actions are both effective and compliant with the fundamental tenets of IHL, particularly the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a meticulous calculation of the number of individuals requiring immediate medical attention and a proportional assessment of the available medical supplies. This approach directly aligns with the core principles of IHL, specifically the principle of proportionality, which requires that the anticipated military advantage not be excessive in relation to the incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, damage to civilian objects, or a combination thereof. In this context, the military advantage is the successful treatment of the wounded, and the excessive loss would be failing to treat those most in need due to misallocation. The calculation would involve determining the number of individuals who can be treated with the available supplies, prioritizing those with the most critical injuries, and then calculating the remaining capacity. For instance, if 100 individuals require immediate attention and the available supplies can treat 75, the organization must prioritize the 75 most critically injured. The remaining 25, while in need, cannot be treated with current resources, and the organization must then explore alternative solutions or accept the unfortunate reality of resource limitations, always striving to maximize the impact within legal and ethical bounds. This is a direct application of IHL's humanitarian imperative. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to distribute the medical supplies equally among all 100 individuals, regardless of the severity of their injuries or the quantity of supplies needed per individual. This fails to address the most urgent needs and could result in insufficient treatment for many, potentially leading to preventable deaths or prolonged suffering. It violates the spirit of IHL by not maximizing the positive humanitarian impact achievable with the limited resources. Another incorrect approach would be to prioritize individuals based on factors unrelated to their medical condition, such as their perceived social status or proximity to the distribution point. This is ethically reprehensible and directly contravenes the humanitarian principles that underpin IHL, which demand impartiality and a focus on need. A third incorrect approach would be to withhold the supplies entirely due to the inability to treat all 100 individuals, arguing that partial treatment is not permissible. This would be a grave failure to uphold the humanitarian obligation to alleviate suffering to the greatest extent possible, even with limited resources. IHL encourages the provision of aid to the fullest extent possible. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a systematic decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the legal obligations under IHL. This involves identifying the protected persons and the nature of the harm. Next, a quantitative assessment of needs and resources is crucial. This should be followed by a qualitative assessment of the severity of injuries and the potential impact of treatment. The principle of proportionality must then be applied to guide resource allocation, ensuring that the greatest humanitarian good is achieved within the constraints. Finally, continuous monitoring and adaptation of the strategy are necessary as the situation evolves. Question 11. Process analysis reveals that during an armed conflict in Alabama, a military commander identifies a legitimate military objective located within a densely populated urban area. The commander is aware that enemy forces are using the vicinity of this objective to launch attacks. Considering the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks under international humanitarian law, which approach best ensures compliance with Alabama's obligations? Option A. Assume that any civilian presence near a military objective is a deliberate attempt by the enemy to shield their forces, thereby negating the attacker's obligation to minimize collateral damage. Option B. Proceed with the attack on the military objective immediately, as the presence of enemy forces in the vicinity legitimizes any action taken against the objective. Option C. Rely solely on the initial identification of the objective as military and authorize the attack without further detailed assessment of potential civilian harm, trusting that standard operating procedures will inherently protect civilians. Option D. Conduct a thorough assessment of the anticipated incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects, and weigh this against the concrete and direct military advantage expected from attacking the objective. If the anticipated harm is excessive in relation to the military advantage, the attack must be prohibited. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough assessment of the anticipated incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects, and weigh this against the concrete and direct military advantage expected from attacking the objective. If the anticipated harm is excessive in relation to the military advantage, the attack must be prohibited. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a significant professional challenge due to the inherent difficulty in distinguishing between legitimate military targets and protected civilian objects during armed conflict, especially when the latter are in close proximity to the former. The prohibition of indiscriminate attacks under international humanitarian law (IHL) requires combatants to take all feasible precautions to avoid, and in any event to minimize, incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects. The pressure of military operations, the fog of war, and the potential for enemy forces to deliberately place military objectives within or near civilian areas complicate this obligation, demanding meticulous assessment and adherence to legal principles. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a rigorous and continuous assessment of the proportionality of an attack. This approach mandates that before launching an attack which may be expected to cause incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, damage to civilian objects, or a combination thereof, which would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated, such an attack must be prohibited. This requires combatants to actively seek and verify intelligence regarding potential civilian presence and the nature of the target, to assess the expected collateral damage, and to weigh this against the anticipated military gain. The Alabama Code, in its incorporation of IHL principles, emphasizes this careful balancing act. The obligation is not merely to avoid direct attacks on civilians, but to ensure that anticipated collateral damage does not outweigh the military necessity. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach assumes that if a military objective is identified, any attack upon it is permissible, regardless of the foreseeable civilian harm. This fundamentally misunderstands the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks and the principle of proportionality. It fails to account for the obligation to take all feasible precautions to minimize civilian casualties and damage. Such an approach risks violating IHL by treating civilian presence as an irrelevant factor in targeting decisions. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on the fact that enemy combatants may be operating in the vicinity of civilian areas as justification for an attack. While the presence of enemy forces near civilian objects does not automatically render those objects immune from attack, it does not absolve the attacking force from its IHL obligations. This approach neglects the crucial requirement to assess proportionality and to take precautions to distinguish between combatants and civilians, and between military objectives and civilian objects. It wrongly presumes that the enemy's actions negate the attacker's legal duties. A further incorrect approach involves delegating the entire decision-making process regarding potential collateral damage to lower-ranking personnel without adequate oversight or clear guidelines. While initiative is important, the gravity of decisions involving potential civilian harm necessitates a robust command structure and clear protocols for assessing proportionality and minimizing incidental effects. This approach risks inconsistent application of IHL and a failure to meet the high standards required for such critical judgments. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such dilemmas must employ a structured decision-making process rooted in IHL. This involves 1. Information gathering and verification. diligently collecting and verifying intelligence about the target and its surroundings, paying close attention to any indication of civilian presence or protected objects. 2. Target assessment. Evaluating whether the object meets the definition of a military objective and assessing the expected incidental harm to civilians and civilian objects. 3. Proportionality analysis. Weighing the anticipated concrete and direct military advantage against the expected incidental harm. If the incidental harm is excessive, the attack must be canceled or suspended. 4. Precautionary measures. Implementing all feasible precautions to minimize incidental harm, such as choosing the timing of the attack, the weapons used, and issuing warnings if possible. 5. Command and control. Ensuring clear lines of responsibility and robust oversight for targeting decisions, particularly those with a high risk of collateral damage. Question 12. Governance review demonstrates that Alabama's international humanitarian aid programs are expanding into regions with significant civilian populations, including a high proportion of women and children. Considering Alabama's obligations under international humanitarian law, which of the following approaches best ensures the special protections afforded to women and children in these contexts? Option A. Distribute aid equitably to all beneficiaries, assuming that general security measures will adequately protect all individuals, regardless of age or gender. Option B. Delegate the primary responsibility for the protection of women and children to local implementing partners, without establishing direct oversight or reporting requirements. Option C. Focus primarily on providing general medical assistance and food aid, with the understanding that these basic needs will indirectly safeguard vulnerable groups. Option D. Proactively integrate specific protocols for the protection of women and children into all aid distribution and program design, including measures to prevent gender-based violence and support family reunification. The correct answer is D. Proactively integrate specific protocols for the protection of women and children into all aid distribution and program design, including measures to prevent gender-based violence and support family reunification. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent vulnerability of women and children in conflict zones and the imperative to uphold international humanitarian law (IHL) principles. The specific context of Alabama's engagement with international aid efforts requires a nuanced understanding of how to apply these protections within a framework that respects state sovereignty while fulfilling humanitarian obligations. The difficulty lies in balancing the immediate needs of vulnerable populations with the legal and ethical duties to ensure their safety and dignity, particularly when resources may be strained or competing priorities exist. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all actions taken are consistent with the highest standards of protection afforded by IHL. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves proactively integrating specific protocols for the protection of women and children into all aspects of aid distribution and program design within Alabama's international humanitarian initiatives. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the heightened risks faced by these groups, such as sexual violence, exploitation, and family separation, by embedding protective measures from the outset. Alabama's commitment to IHL mandates that it not only refrain from harming these protected groups, but also take active steps to safeguard them. This proactive integration aligns with the spirit and letter of international conventions and customary IHL, which emphasize special protection for women and children due to their particular vulnerabilities. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves treating all beneficiaries equally without specific considerations for the unique needs and risks faced by women and children. This fails to meet the IHL requirement for special protection, as it overlooks the distinct vulnerabilities that necessitate tailored interventions. Ethically and legally, this approach is deficient because it can inadvertently lead to the neglect or further endangerment of these protected groups. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on general security measures without implementing targeted programs designed to prevent gender-based violence or support unaccompanied minors. While general security is important, it is insufficient to address the specific threats that women and children face, such as targeted exploitation or the psychological trauma of displacement. This approach neglects the affirmative duty to protect and promote the well-being of these vulnerable populations. A further incorrect approach is to delegate the responsibility for protecting women and children entirely to local partners, without establishing clear oversight and accountability mechanisms. While collaboration is essential, Alabama retains a fundamental responsibility under IHL to ensure that the protections afforded to women and children are consistently applied and effective. A lack of oversight can lead to gaps in protection and a failure to address violations. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a framework that begins with a thorough assessment of the specific risks and vulnerabilities faced by women and children in the operational context. This assessment should inform the development of targeted protection strategies, including safe spaces, gender-sensitive programming, and robust reporting mechanisms for protection concerns. Continuous monitoring and evaluation are crucial to ensure the effectiveness of these measures and to adapt them as circumstances change. Accountability for upholding these protections must be clearly defined at all levels of the initiative. Question 13. Regulatory review indicates that during an armed conflict in Alabama, a commander is considering an attack on a known enemy communication hub located within a densely populated urban area. Intelligence suggests the hub is critical for coordinating enemy offensives. However, there is also a high probability that the attack will cause significant incidental civilian casualties and damage to nearby civilian infrastructure, including a hospital. What is the most appropriate course of action for the commander under Alabama's adherence to international humanitarian law principles? Option A. Attack the communication hub, assuming that all structures within a military operational area are legitimate targets and that the enemy bears responsibility for civilian presence. Option B. Postpone the attack indefinitely due to the high probability of civilian casualties and the presence of a hospital, even if it means allowing the enemy to continue their offensive unimpeded. Option C. Conduct a thorough proportionality assessment, weighing the anticipated concrete and direct military advantage against the expected incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects. And if the expected harm is excessive, cancel or suspend the attack, ensuring all feasible precautions are taken. Option D. Proceed with the attack immediately to neutralize the critical communication hub, prioritizing the military advantage gained by disrupting enemy coordination. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough proportionality assessment, weighing the anticipated concrete and direct military advantage against the expected incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to civilian objects, and if the expected harm is excessive, cancel or suspend the attack, ensuring all feasible precautions are taken. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a significant challenge because it requires a commander to balance military necessity with the imperative to protect civilian life and property, a core tenet of international humanitarian law (IHL). The commander must make a rapid, high-stakes decision under pressure, with incomplete information, where a wrong choice could lead to unlawful civilian casualties or the failure to achieve a legitimate military objective. The potential for misinterpretation of intelligence and the inherent unpredictability of combat operations amplify the professional difficulty. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a meticulous assessment of the proportionality of the attack. This approach requires the commander to weigh the anticipated concrete and direct military advantage against the expected incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, damage to civilian objects, or a combination thereof. If the expected incidental harm to civilians and civilian objects is excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated, the attack must be canceled or suspended. This aligns directly with Article 51(5)(b) of Additional Protocol I to the Geneva Conventions, which Alabama adheres to in its interpretation and application of IHL principles. The commander must ensure that all feasible precautions are taken to avoid or minimize incidental civilian harm, including verifying targets, choosing means and methods of attack that minimize harm, and providing effective advance warning when circumstances permit. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves proceeding with the attack solely based on the potential to disrupt enemy communications, without adequately assessing the proportionality of the expected civilian harm. This fails to meet the IHL requirement to balance military advantage against civilian protection. Another incorrect approach is to indefinitely postpone the attack due to the mere presence of civilians, even if the military objective is of significant importance and the risk to civilians can be minimized through careful planning and execution. This could lead to the loss of a critical military opportunity without a proper IHL justification for the delay. Finally, an approach that relies on a generalized assumption that all structures in a military area are legitimate targets without specific verification and proportionality assessment is also unacceptable. This disregards the obligation to distinguish between combatants and civilians, and between military objectives and civilian objects. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such dilemmas should employ a structured decision-making process. This involves 1. Clearly identifying the military objective and its importance. 2. Gathering and critically evaluating all available intelligence regarding the presence of civilians and civilian objects. 3. Applying the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution rigorously. 4. Consulting with legal advisors when time and circumstances permit. 5. Documenting the decision-making process and the rationale behind the chosen course of action. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are grounded in IHL and ethical considerations, rather than solely on operational expediency. Question 14. Performance analysis shows that in a scenario within Alabama where security forces are engaged in a counterinsurgency operation and face a direct, imminent threat from an enemy combatant concealed within a densely populated civilian area, what is the most appropriate course of action to uphold both self-defense and military necessity while adhering to the principles of international humanitarian law? Option A. Immediately employ overwhelming force to eliminate the threat, prioritizing the safety of security personnel above all other considerations, given the direct and imminent nature of the danger. Option B. Cease all offensive operations and withdraw from the area to avoid any potential risk of civilian casualties, even if it means allowing the enemy combatant to escape and potentially regroup. Option C. Engage the enemy combatant with the minimum force necessary to neutralize the immediate threat, after issuing clear warnings to civilians in the vicinity and assessing all feasible alternatives to minimize collateral damage. Option D. Engage the enemy combatant using any means available to ensure their immediate incapacitation, without specific regard for the potential for civilian harm, as the primary objective is to neutralize the threat to security forces. Correct answer is C. Engage the enemy combatant with the minimum force necessary to neutralize the immediate threat, after issuing clear warnings to civilians in the vicinity and assessing all feasible alternatives to minimize collateral damage. Explanation. Performance analysis shows that situations involving the use of force in self-defense and military necessity within Alabama's legal framework, particularly concerning international humanitarian law principles, present significant professional challenges. The core difficulty lies in balancing the immediate need for self-preservation or mission accomplishment with the stringent legal and ethical obligations to minimize harm to civilians and protected objects. Alabama law, while not directly codifying international humanitarian law (IHL), operates within a broader legal context where principles of proportionality and necessity are fundamental to the lawful use of force, both domestically and in contexts that might intersect with IHL. The challenge is to apply these overarching principles to specific, often rapidly evolving, battlefield or security scenarios, ensuring that any use of force is not only justified by immediate threat, but also proportionate to the military advantage gained, and does not cause excessive civilian harm. The best professional approach involves a meticulous assessment of the immediate threat to personnel or mission objectives, coupled with a rigorous evaluation of the potential collateral damage to civilian life and property. This approach prioritizes de-escalation and the use of the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat. It requires commanders and personnel to consider all feasible alternatives to the use of force, including warning the adversary, employing non-lethal means, or repositioning to avoid engagement, before resorting to lethal force. The justification for this approach stems from the fundamental principles of IHL, which Alabama law implicitly respects through its emphasis on lawful conduct and the protection of non-combatants. The principle of military necessity permits only those measures that are indispensable for achieving a legitimate military purpose, and the principle of proportionality prohibits attacks that may be expected to cause incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, damage to civilian objects, or a combination thereof, which would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the immediate threat without adequately considering the proportionality of the response or the potential for civilian harm. This might manifest as employing overwhelming force to neutralize a minor threat, thereby causing disproportionate civilian casualties or damage. Such an action would fail to adhere to the principle of proportionality, as the military advantage gained would be excessive compared to the incidental harm caused. Another flawed approach is to assume that any action taken in self-defense automatically satisfies the requirements of military necessity and proportionality, without a careful, context-specific analysis. This overlooks the obligation to distinguish between combatants and civilians, and to take all feasible precautions to avoid or minimize incidental loss of civilian life and damage to civilian objects. Furthermore, a failure to explore or implement de-escalation measures or less harmful alternatives before resorting to force constitutes a significant ethical and legal failing, as it disregards the IHL imperative to protect civilian populations. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a structured process that begins with a clear understanding of the mission objectives and the rules of engagement. This is followed by a rapid but thorough assessment of the threat, including its nature, imminence, and the capabilities of the adversary. Crucially, this assessment must be integrated with an evaluation of the surrounding civilian environment, potential collateral damage, and the availability of less harmful courses of action. Commanders must then apply the principles of military necessity and proportionality to determine the lawful and ethical use of force. Continuous reevaluation of the situation and adherence to the principle of distinction are paramount throughout the engagement. Question 15. Market research demonstrates a significant humanitarian need within a specific region of Alabama affected by a natural disaster. An international humanitarian organization, experienced in disaster response, is poised to deliver essential supplies. However, local and state authorities in Alabama have expressed concerns regarding the security implications of uncoordinated aid delivery and have established specific protocols for the entry and distribution of external assistance. What is the most appropriate course of action for the humanitarian organization to ensure effective and lawful delivery of aid? Option A. Proactively engage with relevant state and local authorities in Alabama to understand and comply with their established protocols for aid delivery, while clearly communicating the humanitarian nature and intended beneficiaries of the assistance, and seeking explicit consent for access and distribution. Option B. Prioritize the immediate needs of the beneficiaries by initiating aid distribution without delay, and address any concerns raised by Alabama authorities after the initial delivery has commenced. Option C. Proceed with the delivery of aid directly to the affected population, bypassing state and local authorities, based on the urgency of the humanitarian situation and the organization's expertise in disaster response. Option D. Suspend all aid operations in Alabama until a comprehensive and unambiguous legal framework for international humanitarian assistance is established, to avoid any potential legal or security complications. The correct answer is A. Proactively engage with relevant state and local authorities in Alabama to understand and comply with their established protocols for aid delivery, while clearly communicating the humanitarian nature and intended beneficiaries of the assistance, and seeking explicit consent for access and distribution. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between the urgent need to deliver life-saving humanitarian assistance and the imperative to respect the sovereignty and security concerns of the host state, particularly in a conflict zone within Alabama. Navigating these competing demands requires a nuanced understanding of international humanitarian law principles and the specific legal framework governing humanitarian access in Alabama. Careful judgment is essential to ensure aid reaches those in need without inadvertently violating international law or jeopardizing the safety of humanitarian personnel. The most appropriate approach involves a multi-pronged strategy that prioritizes direct engagement with relevant authorities in Alabama, coupled with robust information gathering and adherence to established humanitarian principles. This includes seeking explicit consent for access, clearly communicating the humanitarian nature of the assistance, and coordinating with local and state entities to ensure safe passage and distribution. This approach is correct because it aligns with the fundamental principles of humanitarian action, including humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, as well as the legal obligations under international humanitarian law, which generally require states to allow and facilitate the rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief. Specifically, in Alabama, this would involve understanding any state-specific regulations or agreements that might govern the entry and operation of international aid organizations, while always upholding the overarching principles of international humanitarian law. An incorrect approach would be to bypass state authorities and attempt to deliver aid unilaterally, relying solely on the urgency of the humanitarian situation. This fails to respect the sovereignty of Alabama and could lead to the confiscation of aid, detention of personnel, or escalation of tensions, ultimately hindering humanitarian efforts. It also risks violating any specific state-level protocols for aid delivery, which, while subordinate to international law, must be considered for practical implementation. Another incorrect approach would be to prioritize the perceived needs of the beneficiaries over the legal and security requirements of the host state, leading to a confrontational stance. While the humanitarian imperative is strong, ignoring the legal framework and security concerns of Alabama can result in the denial of access altogether, or worse, put aid workers and recipients at greater risk. This approach neglects the principle of impartiality by potentially aligning with one faction or perceived need over another in a way that could be seen as politically motivated. A final incorrect approach would be to delay assistance indefinitely due to an overly cautious interpretation of access requirements, leading to paralysis. While due diligence is necessary, an excessive focus on bureaucratic hurdles without actively pursuing engagement and seeking clarification can result in preventable suffering. This approach fails to embody the principle of humanity by not acting with due diligence to alleviate suffering when opportunities for safe and legal access exist. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough assessment of the humanitarian needs and the operating environment. This should be followed by a proactive and respectful engagement with all relevant authorities in Alabama, seeking to understand their concerns and legal requirements. Simultaneously, humanitarian organizations must adhere strictly to their core principles and operational guidelines, ensuring transparency and accountability in their actions. When faced with access challenges, a strategy of persistent, principled negotiation, coupled with clear communication and a willingness to adapt operational plans within legal and ethical boundaries, is paramount. Question 16. Process analysis reveals that a humanitarian organization operating in Alabama during an armed conflict is faced with requests from different factions to prioritize aid delivery to specific communities. Considering the organization's mandate under international humanitarian law, what is the most appropriate course of action to ensure the effective and ethical delivery of assistance? Option A. Distribute aid strictly based on demonstrated humanitarian need, irrespective of the community's affiliation or the requests of any party to the conflict, while maintaining strict neutrality in all communications and operations. Option B. Accept guidance from a dominant military force on which communities are most deserving of aid, as their strategic objectives may align with efficient resource allocation. Option C. Prioritize aid delivery to communities that express strong support for the organization's presence and are perceived to be aligned with a particular side of the conflict, as this may facilitate safer access. Option D. Publicly advocate for the rights of specific vulnerable groups within the conflict zone, linking this advocacy directly to the organization's aid distribution plans to garner support. The correct answer is A. Distribute aid strictly based on demonstrated humanitarian need, irrespective of the community's affiliation or the requests of any party to the conflict, while maintaining strict neutrality in all communications and operations. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a humanitarian organization operating in Alabama during an armed conflict. The core difficulty lies in balancing the imperative to provide essential aid to affected civilians with the obligation to respect the laws of armed conflict, specifically regarding the neutrality and impartiality of humanitarian action. Misinterpreting or failing to adhere to these principles can lead to accusations of bias, endanger aid workers, compromise future access, and undermine the organization's overall mission. Careful judgment is required to navigate the complex political and military landscape while upholding fundamental humanitarian principles. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a rigorous adherence to the core principles of humanitarian action: humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. This means that the organization must ensure its aid distribution is based solely on need, without regard to race, religion, nationality, or political affiliation. It requires maintaining a strictly neutral stance in hostilities, avoiding any actions that could be perceived as supporting or opposing any party to the conflict. Independence is crucial, meaning the organization's decisions are guided by humanitarian needs alone, free from political, economic, or military pressures. This approach is correct because it aligns directly with the foundational tenets of international humanitarian law and the ethical framework governing humanitarian organizations, as codified in various international agreements and guidelines, ensuring the safety and effectiveness of operations and maintaining trust with all parties and beneficiaries. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves prioritizing aid to a specific ethnic group perceived as being aligned with one of the conflict's parties. This violates the principle of impartiality, as aid should be distributed based on need alone, not on affiliation. Such a discriminatory approach risks alienating other affected populations, potentially leading to increased hostility towards the organization and jeopardizing its ability to operate effectively and safely for all. Another incorrect approach is to accept direction from a military force regarding aid distribution routes and beneficiary selection. This compromises the principle of independence. By allowing external military direction, the organization risks being perceived as an instrument of one party to the conflict, thereby losing its neutral status. This can lead to attacks by opposing forces and a loss of access to those in need who are not favored by the directing military entity. A third incorrect approach is to publicly condemn the actions of one party to the conflict while providing aid to those affected by their actions. While humanitarian organizations may have ethical concerns about violations of international law, public condemnation, especially when linked to their operational activities, can be seen as a breach of neutrality. This can lead to retaliation from the condemned party, hindering humanitarian access and endangering aid workers and beneficiaries. Professional reasoning. Professionals in humanitarian organizations should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding and consistent application of the core humanitarian principles. When faced with complex operational challenges, they must first assess the situation through the lens of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. This involves consulting established organizational policies, international humanitarian law, and seeking guidance from experienced colleagues or legal advisors specializing in humanitarian law. Any proposed action or decision must be evaluated against these principles. If an action risks compromising any of these core tenets, it must be revised or rejected. Continuous training and adherence to ethical codes are vital to ensure that decisions are consistently aligned with humanitarian mandates and the protection of vulnerable populations. Question 17. Process analysis reveals that in the context of an armed conflict within Alabama, a humanitarian organization seeks to deliver essential medical supplies to a besieged civilian population. Considering the legal and practical realities of accessing affected populations, which of the following approaches best balances the imperative of humanitarian aid with the principles of state sovereignty and security? Option A. Immediately attempt to cross designated checkpoints and enter restricted areas to deliver the supplies, prioritizing speed over obtaining prior authorization. Option B. Initiate direct, good faith negotiations with the relevant authorities in Alabama, presenting detailed humanitarian needs assessments and proposed access plans, while seeking their cooperation and consent for the delivery of supplies. Option C. Proceed with the delivery of supplies as quickly as possible, without extensive coordination or consideration of potential security risks or local sensitivities, to ensure the aid reaches the population without delay. Option D. Bypass all local and state authorities in Alabama and directly petition international bodies to mandate access for the humanitarian organization. The correct answer is B. Initiate direct, good faith negotiations with the relevant authorities in Alabama, presenting detailed humanitarian needs assessments and proposed access plans, while seeking their cooperation and consent for the delivery of supplies. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the urgent need to deliver life-saving humanitarian aid with the imperative to respect the sovereignty and security concerns of the state, even in a conflict zone. Navigating these competing demands necessitates a nuanced understanding of international humanitarian law, IHL, principles and the practical realities of accessing populations in distress within Alabama's borders during an armed conflict. Failure to achieve access can have catastrophic humanitarian consequences, while disregarding state concerns could lead to escalation or hinder broader humanitarian efforts. Direct approach analysis. The most appropriate approach involves engaging in direct, good-faith negotiations with the relevant authorities within Alabama, presenting clear humanitarian needs assessments and proposed access plans. This approach is correct because it aligns with the fundamental principles of IHL, particularly the obligation of parties to an armed conflict to facilitate the rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief. Alabama's legal framework, as it pertains to internal conflict or disaster response, would implicitly or explicitly recognize the need for coordination and consent for external aid, while also upholding the rights of affected populations. This method prioritizes cooperation and adherence to established legal and practical protocols, ensuring that aid delivery is both effective and legitimate. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to unilaterally attempt to deliver aid by crossing designated checkpoints or entering restricted areas without prior authorization from Alabama's authorities. This disregards the principle of state sovereignty and security, which, even in conflict, remains a consideration. Such an action could be interpreted as a violation of local laws or security protocols, potentially jeopardizing the safety of humanitarian personnel and the affected population, and could lead to the confiscation of aid or expulsion of aid workers, thereby hindering future access. Another incorrect approach is to bypass local authorities entirely and appeal directly to international bodies for intervention to force access. While international bodies play a crucial role in advocacy, direct intervention to compel access without exhausting negotiation channels is often not the primary or most effective first step. This approach fails to acknowledge the primary responsibility of the state to protect its population and facilitate aid, and can be perceived as confrontational, potentially damaging long-term relationships and cooperation necessary for sustained humanitarian operations within Alabama. A third incorrect approach is to prioritize speed of delivery over all other considerations, including the safety and security of the operation and the affected population, and the need for coordination. While urgency is paramount in humanitarian crises, a reckless approach that ignores potential risks or local sensitivities can lead to unintended negative consequences. This could include endangering aid workers, exacerbating local tensions, or inadvertently providing cover for illicit activities, all of which undermine the humanitarian mission and could lead to denial of access in the future. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a phased approach to access negotiations. This begins with thorough needs assessment and planning, followed by direct engagement with relevant state and local authorities in Alabama. The focus should be on building trust and demonstrating the humanitarian nature of the operation. If initial negotiations are unsuccessful, a strategy of escalating engagement, involving mediation or seeking support from neutral third parties, should be considered, always within the framework of IHL and respect for sovereignty. Documentation of all attempts and responses is crucial for accountability and future advocacy. Question 18. Stakeholder feedback indicates a need for clarity regarding the classification of armed conflicts under Alabama law. Consider a scenario where organized armed groups, operating entirely within the borders of Alabama, engage in protracted and intense violence against state security forces and civilian populations. These groups have a clear command structure and are capable of carrying out coordinated military operations. Based on these facts, which of the following approaches best aligns with the classification of armed conflicts under Alabama's regulatory framework and international humanitarian law principles? Option A. Classify the conflict as a non-international armed conflict solely because the violence is occurring within Alabama's borders, without further analysis of the group's organization or the conflict's intensity. Option B. Classify the conflict as an international armed conflict due to the high intensity and protracted nature of the violence, irrespective of whether it involves the territory of another state. Option C. Classify the conflict based on the perceived political grievances of the armed groups, deeming it an international armed conflict if their aims are seen as challenging state sovereignty. Option D. Classify the conflict by meticulously examining whether the factual circumstances meet the established legal criteria for an international armed conflict, considering the territorial scope and the nature of the parties involved, and if not, determining if it constitutes a non-international armed conflict. The correct answer is D. Classify the conflict by meticulously examining whether the factual circumstances meet the established legal criteria for an international armed conflict, considering the territorial scope and the nature of the parties involved, and if not, determining if it constitutes a non-international armed conflict. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires a nuanced understanding of the Alabama Code and international humanitarian law principles to correctly classify an armed conflict. Misclassification can lead to significant legal and ethical consequences, including the improper application of rules governing the conduct of hostilities, the treatment of persons, and the potential for war crimes charges. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between different types of conflicts based on their specific characteristics. The best professional approach involves a thorough analysis of the factual circumstances to determine if the conflict meets the threshold for an international armed conflict, IAC, under the Alabama Code and customary international humanitarian law. This requires assessing whether there is a resort to armed force between two or more states, or a protracted armed violence between governmental authorities and organized armed groups, or between such groups within a state that reaches a certain intensity and organization. Specifically, for Alabama, the relevant legal framework would look to how the state interprets and applies the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols, and any state-specific legislation that might codify or supplement these principles. The key is to apply the established criteria for IACs, which typically involve the territorial element, crossing international borders, and the parties involved states or entities acting on behalf of states. An incorrect approach would be to classify the conflict solely based on the intensity of violence, without considering the territorial element or the nature of the parties involved. For instance, labeling a conflict as an IAC simply because it is widespread and involves significant casualties, even if it is entirely internal and does not involve the territory of another state, would be a regulatory failure. This ignores the fundamental distinction between IACs and non-international armed conflicts, NIAC, which have different legal regimes. Another incorrect approach would be to classify the conflict based on the political motivations of the parties rather than the objective legal criteria for armed conflict classification. This introduces subjective bias and deviates from the established legal framework for determining the applicable law. Professionals should employ a systematic decision-making process that begins with a comprehensive factual investigation. This involves gathering all available information regarding the parties to the conflict, the geographical scope of the hostilities, the level of organization of the armed groups, and the duration and intensity of the violence. This factual matrix should then be rigorously analyzed against the legal definitions and criteria for classifying armed conflicts as set forth in the Alabama Code and relevant international humanitarian law treaties and customary law. The process should be objective, evidence-based, and free from political or emotional influence, ensuring adherence to the established legal framework. Question 19. Process analysis reveals that a humanitarian organization operating in Alabama is seeking to ensure its implementation of international humanitarian law (IHL) principles is fully compliant with the state's legal framework. Which of the following approaches best ensures this compliance? Option A. Conducting a comprehensive review of Alabama's codified laws and administrative regulations, specifically addressing the implementation and oversight of international humanitarian principles within the state. Option B. Prioritizing compliance with federal statutes related to international humanitarian law, assuming this automatically satisfies all state-level obligations in Alabama. Option C. Relying exclusively on general principles of international humanitarian law and the organization's internal ethical guidelines, assuming they adequately cover state-level requirements. Option D. Seeking guidance solely from international humanitarian law advocacy groups and non-governmental organizations, without consulting Alabama's official legal resources. The correct answer is A. Conducting a comprehensive review of Alabama's codified laws and administrative regulations, specifically addressing the implementation and oversight of international humanitarian principles within the state. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires navigating the complex interplay between national implementation of international humanitarian law (IHL) and the specific operational realities of a humanitarian organization. The core challenge lies in ensuring that the organization's actions in Alabama, while adhering to its internal policies and IHL principles, also align with the specific legal framework and reporting requirements established by Alabama for such activities. Misinterpreting or overlooking Alabama's specific implementation mechanisms could lead to non-compliance, hindering the organization's mission and potentially exposing it to legal scrutiny. Correct approach analysis. The best approach involves a thorough review of Alabama's codified laws and administrative regulations pertaining to the implementation and oversight of international humanitarian principles within the state. This includes identifying any specific reporting mandates, licensing requirements, or procedural guidelines that Alabama has enacted to ensure compliance with IHL in practice. By proactively engaging with these state-specific legal instruments, the organization can ensure its operational framework is not only consistent with general IHL principles, but also demonstrably compliant with Alabama's legislative intent and regulatory framework. This proactive, state-specific due diligence is crucial for legitimate and effective operation. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to rely solely on general principles of IHL and the organization's internal ethical guidelines, without verifying their alignment with Alabama's specific legal implementation. While IHL provides a foundational framework, states have the sovereign right and responsibility to implement these principles through their own legal systems. Ignoring Alabama's specific statutes or regulations would be a failure to comply with the domestic legal obligations that govern the organization's activities within the state. Another incorrect approach is to assume that compliance with federal IHL-related statutes automatically satisfies all state-level requirements. Federal laws may set a baseline, but states can enact more stringent or specific regulations. Therefore, a focus solely on federal compliance without examining Alabama's unique legislative landscape would be insufficient and potentially lead to violations of state law. A further incorrect approach is to seek guidance only from international bodies or non-governmental organizations that advocate for IHL, without consulting Alabama's official legal resources. While these external sources can offer valuable insights into IHL interpretation, they do not supersede or replace the specific legal requirements enacted by the state of Alabama for entities operating within its jurisdiction. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should adopt a hierarchical approach to legal compliance. First, they must identify the governing jurisdiction, Alabama. Second, they must exhaustively research and understand the specific statutes, regulations, and administrative rules enacted by Alabama that pertain to the implementation of international humanitarian law. Third, they should cross-reference these state-specific requirements with general IHL principles and the organization's internal policies to ensure a comprehensive and compliant operational framework. This systematic process ensures that all legal obligations, both domestic and international, are met. Question 20. The audit findings indicate a potential shortfall in the provision of essential medical supplies to a civilian population in a non-international armed conflict within Alabama. Based on the latest intelligence, it is projected that 500 civilians will require medical attention due to conflict-related injuries. The established minimum per-person allocation for essential medical kits in such situations is 0.75 kits per injured individual. If the humanitarian organization has 900 essential medical kits currently available for distribution, what is the minimum number of additional kits required to meet the projected needs, and what is the percentage deficit of the available kits compared to the total requirement? Option A. A minimum of 750 additional kits are required, representing a 50% deficit of the available kits compared to the total requirement. Option B. A minimum of 300 additional kits are required, representing a 40% deficit of the available kits compared to the total requirement. Option C. A minimum of 225 additional kits are required, representing a 33% deficit of the available kits compared to the total requirement. Option D. A minimum of 600 additional kits are required, representing a 50% 0% deficit of the available kits compared to the total requirement. The correct answer is C. A minimum of 225 additional kits are required, representing a 33% deficit of the available kits compared to the total requirement. Explanation: the audit findings indicate a potential shortfall in the provision of essential medical supplies to a civilian population in a non-international armed conflict within Alabama, as governed by the principles of international humanitarian law (IHL), applicable to such conflicts. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a precise calculation of the minimum required medical supplies based on projected casualty figures and the established per-person allocation standards, while also adhering to the principles of distinction and proportionality. The audit's concern stems from a discrepancy between the calculated need and the actual distribution, raising questions about the adequacy of humanitarian assistance. The correct approach involves a meticulous calculation of the total medical supply requirement by multiplying the projected number of wounded civilians by the minimum per-person allocation of essential medical kits. This method directly addresses the humanitarian imperative to provide adequate care to those affected by the conflict, aligning with the principles of IHL that mandate the provision of humanitarian assistance to civilians in need. Specifically, it reflects the obligation to facilitate the rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief consignments, provided that the humanitarian nature of the consignments is duly recognized and their use is in conformity with IHL. The calculation ensures that the projected needs are met based on established humanitarian standards. An incorrect approach would be to simply distribute the available medical supplies without a quantitative assessment of the actual need based on projected casualties. This fails to uphold the principle of providing adequate humanitarian assistance and risks leaving a significant portion of the affected population without necessary medical care. It neglects the quantitative aspect of humanitarian aid, which is crucial for ensuring that assistance is sufficient to alleviate suffering. Another incorrect approach would be to prioritize distribution based on proximity to military objectives or strategic importance, rather than on the severity of medical need. This violates the fundamental IHL principle of distinction, which requires distinguishing between combatants and civilians, and between military objectives and civilian objects. Humanitarian aid must be distributed impartially, based solely on need, without discrimination. A further incorrect approach would be to calculate the required supplies based on a percentage of the total population rather than the projected number of wounded. While population size is a factor in overall humanitarian needs, the specific requirement for medical supplies is directly tied to the number of individuals requiring medical attention due to injuries sustained in the conflict. This method overestimates or underestimates the specific medical needs, potentially leading to either waste or insufficiency of critical resources. The professional reasoning process in such situations should involve 1. Clearly identifying the applicable legal framework, in this case, IHL principles governing non-international armed conflict in Alabama. 2. Accurately assessing the humanitarian needs based on credible data, projected casualties. 3. Applying established humanitarian standards and calculations for resource allocation. 4. Ensuring that distribution is impartial and based solely on need. 5. Documenting all calculations and distribution decisions to ensure accountability and transparency.